All right, welcome everybody. We have made it to near the end of the Better Bidding series. So in our last episode, we talked about preempt style, how to handle, the opponent's takeout double, just mainly about different types of raises. Of course, with the majors, we play transfers in those situations after one major opener. Talked about Michaels, and with Michaels, the fact that I think it's slightly better to play just one club, two clubs is natural, no matter what. Definite opposite like a shorter precision club, absolutely you might want to play something like that, but even opposite a 3+ club, just because there is a higher probability of the time that it is just three, then I think having two clubs as natural is absolutely fine and doesn't really cost you too much. So how we handle that is we just play one club, two clubs as natural, then one club, two diamonds as Michaels. So we do lose the ability to jump in diamonds, but again, you just overcall one or three, I guess, make a judgment call. And then with the one diamond opening, still play that as normal, if it is a normal one diamond opener. Otherwise, if it's like a precision diamond, then probably something similar where one diamond, two diamonds is natural, and we play one diamond, two hearts as Michaels in those situations. And then just talked about how to handle like preempt doubles and Lebensal responses, and specifically with Lebensal after like two major, the ability to maybe play better minor Lebensal as an improvement over regular Lebensal. This one's definitely become a lot more popular since I first recorded the series. But the idea with that is that instead of two no trump forcing three clubs, it instead forces partner the doubler to bid their better minor, because there are a lot of times where you're just trying to scramble. And so this actually probably gets you into your better fit as opposed to maybe playing a worse fit if partner, just bid a 3-card suit, or if they even made like an off-shape double, for example. All right, so in today's video, we're gonna, I think, round this out. Obviously we're not gonna talk too much about leads or carding. I did do a defense series, right after I did the Better Bidding series, many moons ago. I thought some defense haven't necessarily changed that much, so I don't know if I'm going to re-record that, so feel free to check that out. But I think today we're going to just focus on slam bidding and then rounding out the series entirely. Okay, so slam bidding, this is just a small section on the card, but I feel like it's definitely one of the most important parts. Of course it is, because, getting to good slams and staying out of bad ones is pretty critical in, like, tournament play. There will be a certain amount of hands where there's either thin slams or, there's slams where you have the points, but you actually need to stay out of for various situations. And just having the tools in your toolbox to help uncover that can make that all very, very helpful. So when it comes to slam conventions, so for me, I've typically been a 1430 person. I think for starters, you definitely want to play some type of key card. Old-fashioned Blackwood is not very prevalent in today's game, and for good reason. I think knowing about the Queen of Trumps is very, very vital. So I typically go with 1430. There are a small group of people who are pro like 3014, and I don't know. I don't have enough of a preference to go one way or the other. I just feel like that's the one I first started with, and that's the one that I know a lot of people play. Although, again, it's really just, a preference of what you and your partner land on in terms of how you play it. You just have to remember the responses. I play 1430 with so many people that it just seems natural to me. And I would definitely screw something up if somebody just threw 30-14 out of the blue and it was like my first time playing. So that's why I kind of go with it. So 1430, I think the responses, of course, are relatively straightforward, so I don't need to dive in too much to that. When it comes to asking for kings, though, after key carding, I usually go with specific kings. I actually even at one point played a variant where, based on the number of key cards we had shown, we would either show like our number of kings or specific kings. But I do like specific kings a little bit more. I think it is useful to really kind of like get that picture of partner's hand. In specific kings, you can uncover, there's a lot of implications that come alongside it. So for starters, you bid the suit in which, you have your cheapest king. So if, 5 no is your specific king bid, and then you bid, and then responder bid 6 diamonds, well, now you just know they denied the king of clubs, which can really help shape the hand accordingly. Of course, after specific kings, you could have further asks, like if partner maybe bid 6 clubs to show that they have the king of clubs, you could bid 6 diamonds to say, hey, do you also have this? And then partner can, just sign off in 6 or jump to 7, depending on the presence of that card. So you can still string together a proper auction when playing that, but I think the ability to really kind of like put both hands in perspective and see whether the layout's there for 13 tricks or not is really important. That's why I go with that one. All right, so I'm gonna have to drop this. I'm gonna have to drop this one here. For those who have followed the series and those who are part of like my Discord server, like two of the various rules are about not playing kickback. Kickback's kind of like become a meme. As in, oh, why do we play this? And if you and your partner don't see any mileage out of it, and this just goes with anything, of course, you absolutely shouldn't play it. I will say, however, that I think when it comes to minor suit slam bidding, having some type of assets below for no trump is useful. That's why I played kickback for the longest time. And kickback, for reference, is when you bid like 1 over the minor suit to start a keycard sequence. So if you and your partner have agreed on clubs, it should be 4 diamonds, and if you and your partner have agreed on diamonds, it should be hearts. You could even take that one step further and play it also with hearts, where 4 spades becomes your keycard ask instead of 4 no trump. Again, the idea with playing this is that you actually keep all your keycard responses under 5 of your suit. So if you need to bail out, you can. If you're playing 4 no trump as your keycard ask and your suit is clubs or diamonds, it's not too hard to barrel past your suit. And the counter argument would be, well, you shouldn't be asking if that's a possibility, which is fair. But I think in order to keep that from potentially happening, that's kind of like I always play kickback in those situations. But if I was going to say, I think it's definitely important over the minors. After 4 hearts. It comes up in a few fringe cases, but if you don't feel like it's worthwhile, then I absolutely get that. So kickback is one way to handle, like minor suit slam bidding. Another option that some have played is minor wood, where you actually bid 4 of your minor as the ask. This one, I think obviously if you're driving for slam, the situation is a little more clear. Maybe the reason I've kind of like preference myself towards kickback is there's nothing that's nebulous about bidding 1 over your suit. If you're bidding 4 of your minor though, obviously that could be taken a lot of ways, but again, if you're driving towards slam, I guess there's really only one way to take it. So you could play it either way, and you could even take it one step further, which is where you could play what we would call optional minor wood. And we actually I think we actually kind of like covered this a little bit when we were talking about like the 2 no 3 spades auction, which forces 3 no, and then partner shows like a single suited slam try with 4 clubs or 4 diamonds. And what I was saying there when we went back to that, and see, we're calling back on previous videos from this series, so people will definitely bump up the views. What we were saying there is partner would show no interest with just bidding the next step. So if 4 clubs is the way to drive in clubs, 4 diamonds would be no interest, and then any other suit would be confirming the number of key cards and showing interest. And then after that, like next step, which denies interest, partner can then bid the step over that. So if 4 diamonds denies interest over 4 clubs, partner then bids 4 hearts to say, no, I don't care that you don't have interest. I need you to respond with the number of key cards, and you carry on from there. You can still have the same auction. You take up a little more space in doing so, but if you're overriding your partner's lack of interest and you get past 5 of your minor, it's probably not the end of the world at that point. So that is one way. So optional key cards, optional minor wood or kickback, they're all out there. I do think just having the ability to drive for minor suit slams without having to go through 4 no trump is something that's worthwhile. So I'm going to write this down. I'll go with kickback, but again, that's just from personal preference. And with kickback, of course, I'd play the same thing. I'd also play 1430, but just having some type of minor suit slam ask, I think, is useful here. All right, so specific kings, kickback. What else do we need to talk about here? So one thing to point out with kickback is obviously if you're exchanging that 4 no bid for not being used for key card for anything other than spades, then it should carry some other meaning as a Q bid. So the way to think about this, if you and your partner are bidding hearts and then 4 spades is your key card, 4 no trump should be a spade Q bid. And basically 4 no trump should be a Q bid in whatever suit you've just replaced with the key card ask. So if you've agreed to clubs and 4 diamonds is your key card ask, then 4 no should be a diamond Q, and so on and so forth. Of course, you'd still bid your Qs up the line like you would typically, but now you just make sure that you still fit all the suits in, if that makes sense. And Q bidding is another point that's useful when it comes to talking about slam bidding. So the way I've typically approached, Q bidding and I think this is the pretty prevalent style at this point, is what we would call like Italian style, which is cue bidding first and second round controls. It used to be, back in the older days, it used to be more of just like a first round control idea, but again, I think, or at least directly. Directly maybe at the 4 level, you queue your first round controls, and afterwards you could confirm second round. I think including both of them right away is useful though. I mean, it definitely keeps the auctions more open, and less guesswork if you're getting that picture of partner's hand, whether you can figure out that they have like a singleton or the king versus just having an ace or a void. I think that does go a long way in terms of putting the two hands together and judging where it goes. So that's typically the way I've approached cue bidding in those situations. We've also spoken about non-serious and serious slam tries in the past after the major. So I think the more popular one is non-serious, and you could either bid 3 no or 3 major plus 1 as starting like that non-serious sequence, where if you and your partner have agreed on hearts, then 3 spades would be non-serious, and then other bids would be serious cues. Okay, we've definitely made a lot of traction on this in a short amount of time. So let's see, specific kings, kickback. Exclusion is one that also comes up with slam bidding. So one thing I'll say off the gate, and this goes for a lot of things in slam bidding, this goes for kickback as well. Obviously, these situations shouldn't be nebulous. It should be clear that you and your partner have agreed on a suit, and that, I think the auction should resonate with both people, and if you don't think it does, then you should be bidding carefully, because if your partner's not on the same page, you could lead to a disaster. Disasters in the lower levels of the bidding, they usually can work themselves out. When you're already looking for slams and getting too high or staying out of them entirely, that doesn't necessarily tread as well. So you do want to always be careful when it comes to these auctions and make sure you and your partner have discussed them. That's why, despite this being a small box, it's actually very important that you and your partner are on the same page at the end of the day. And exclusion is one of those situations. So for context, exclusion is basically, starting a keycard situation where you have a void and you're telling your partner, hey, I need you to bid or respond with your number of keycards outside of having the ace of this suit, because that doesn't have any use for me. So if you have like a void in spades, for example, you might jump. And keyword is jump here. You have to jump in a situation for it to be, exclusion. For example, like maybe a diamond, 2 diamonds inverted. Now you might jump to 4 spades. That should absolutely be, exclusion in the situation, because you made it as clear as day that you and your partner have established a fit. And if you had spades, you could have bid this naturally at a much lower level. So if you're jumping that high, it should mean something, and exclusion would be what that should actually entail. So for whatever reason, exclusion responses are typically 30-14. I think that's just because it's the more commonplace number of keycards to have in this situation, where you kind of invert that. That way, if you need to bail out, you can. So that's the reason to maybe swap those in that situation. For me, it's just kind of something I've been playing for a while, so it's just resonated with me, but I guess that's actually the leading theory behind it. Now, of course, you could still just play 14-30 and then be like, oh, we're just going to do 14-30 for everything for lack of being confusing. But I will say 30-14 exclusion is the one that is very, very prevalent out there. So I'll write that in here. And I think we've covered our bases. We talked about exclusion, kickback, Gerber, if you want it to exist, you can. Of course, I don't think it's going to come up very often. And the meta rule I would have when it comes to Gerber is it should be directly after we have opened a no trump. Like if 1 no 4 clubs. Okay, if you do that and you're not playing like South African Texas, okay. This is the type of bid that feels like it comes up once a year, because there's so many different ways to bid these hands, whether it's quantitative, whether it's stamening and like using something like reverse bays to make that type of slam try. It doesn't come up very often, but I think it should be directly after a 1 no bid. Of course, Gerber's also a beam, but Gerber deserves to be a beam more than kickback in a sense. Some people have also played this concept of keycard Gerber. Now you might be thinking, how can you have keycard Gerber if you haven't agreed upon a suit? And what I would say to that is typically the way people might play it is where it's like 1 or 4 aces, 0 or 3 aces, and then 2 aces with a bad hand, and then 2 aces with a good hand. That's not necessarily crazy. I think the benefit in this is it actually gets conveys like a quant response at the same time as responding with your number of key cards. That way, a partner was a bit on the fence in terms of how they made that bid, differentiating between the bad and good. Could be the difference between signing up in 4 no trump and overbidding into 6. So again, with these types of auctions that come up maybe once a year, it could be better to do that just for the extra like information it carries, and it isn't that hard to remember. It's kind of like just playing keycard for everything, but if you don't have a suit, then just differentiating between bad and good. All right, handling no trump interference. So there's all these different boxes here. There's Dopey, Depot, and Ropey. The way that I've always played it, and this is just to stay consistent with everything else, and I think this one works pretty well. I've heard it called different things. I like to just call it basically, or the way I like to treat it is, after some type of interference, double is the first step, pass is the second step, and then so on and so forth. And same thing after they double, redouble should be the same thing. So I would say D14, and then something like that. So D14, P30, and same thing with R14, P30. I kind of like that because it's logical, and it makes me think of C3PO. And we are Star Wars stands here. So for that reason, I like it in that sense too. Okay, what else do we need to discuss on the slam bidding? So we talked about Q bidding, we talked about kickback, exclusion, specific kings, and the benefit in that. There are those types of auctions where there also are third round control asks that come into play. This actually did come up on a hand in Philadelphia earlier this year, where we actually had the ability to ask for a third round control, and that was really useful at that stage of the auction where we got to a good 7 no trump for a solid board in a pair event. It's just a slam that was loaded with tricks, and really knowing about that card, because I had like ace king fifth of a suit, and I needed to gauge for queen third, that made all the difference. And when we say third round control, we usually are referring to the queen. If you and your partner have agreed upon a suit, you could actually bid like a different type of response to convey that you had third round control for the suit itself versus having the queen, where you might just use an intermediary bid to convey that as opposed to jumping to 7 directly, which is something that hadn't dawned on me before, but makes a lot of sense. So I guess in the order of precedence and what it comes up in the same auctions, to really kind of like keep your screws bolted in as you're having those types of auctions. Obviously, you start with a key card auction. If your partner bids like 5 no trump or 5 of the key card suit in those situations, that should be then a king ask using specific kings. Same type of thing as well in other auctions where usually it's like maybe the next step ask for the queen and then 2 steps over ask for kings as well. And then if they kind of like after that response, if you even bid more, that could be asking for further kings, or it could be checking for a third round control. Really just context matters here, whether you go through certain types of asks and figuring out what that auction actually entails. I would say maybe if you're kind of like newish to approaching how you bid these things, start slowly and then ramp it up. I think having some building blocks is important, and incorporating more later can go a long way. Don't try to stuff it in all at first, or it could be really easy to kind of like go haywire in those auctions and lead to some bad results. All right, well, I think we've made solid progress through this slam section, and without really anything else to talk about, maybe it's just a good point to stop and summarize what we have, because over the last 2 months or so, actually legitimately almost 2 months, I think this is episode 8, so we've made our way through the convention card. We've talked about a lot of things here, and when we first did this series, we had 10 episodes for perspective, so there definitely is a lot in a convention card. It's just one small piece of paper, but it does carry a lot of useful information, because often you have to go beyond this to think about various sequences as well. So when it comes to the way I like to play, bridge, I think for me it's just about reducing redundancy and trying to maximize the space that we have in auctions. So, there's a lot of bids that can mean various things, but it's about kind of like distilling that down to having them in certain places and having different types of auctions convey different messages. Because the more information that you can convey to your partner, the more likely you can lead to a good result for yourselves. Of course, you and your partner need to be on the same page, so you've got to be able to talk bidding with your partner. After you and your partner have become more established after a certain amount of time, it's useful to have some type of notes in place. Now, I will say that as a friend of someone who has gone, well, maybe friends being generous, but knowing somebody who has gone overboard with notes to a degree that I think is unfathomable, you definitely need to approach those carefully. I think, having a Google Doc or a repo, if you're somebody who likes to see things in kind of like markdown files or some other type of like, fancy text format, I think it goes a really long way to having that in place. You and partner can collaborate on together. You can discuss those things. You got to just have somebody who wants to be as engaged with it as you do. It shouldn't just be a one-sided effort, because if it is, then that's how, being forgetful can come up alongside it. I've been lucky to have some partners over the years where I think we've conveyed kind of like a good starting point, or collaborated on a good starting point in terms of what we're going to play going forward, and it's definitely carried its weight. I definitely refer back to these notes often. If it's been a while since we played, or if I'm ramping up for a tournament like I am now with San Francisco coming up around the corner, I come back to this. So having that in front of me as opposed to just having to look at a much smaller convention card can go a long way. So again, maximizing space, reducing redundancy is a lot of kind of like the basis of my system without being overly complex. I think having things be as natural as they can be in a lot of spots is very useful. I don't like to have artificial bids everywhere along the place. I think you definitely want to make sure that, having various meta principles in place, like most low-level doubles are takeout, and, strange bids are forcing. I think just playing by those principles can serve really well. And at the end of the day, you got to be flexible. I recorded this series 5 years ago, and I had a card there that I felt pretty content with, and while I still play a lot of that as my foundation, I would say that there's been a fair chunk that's changed. I never would have thought that I would be playing kind of like penalty no trumps over strong no trump. While I didn't put that here, I did mention that I did, and other types of things that have come up along the way where having 2-no as kind of like this artificial bid a lot of the time, and just various other kind of like small things that have led to better outcomes. It happens, so you definitely got to be flexible when it comes to that. You don't want to necessarily completely change your system, because it's kind of like golf, where if you just completely change your swing, it's going to take a long time to settle back into it. But you just make these slight tweaks along the way, and you can see where that carries you forward. So I didn't do a new series of notes for this, so for those who are familiar, and the reason this series even kind of like rejuvenated itself is I did have like a Google Doc where I basically actually wrote down all these various things. I didn't prepare a new series of notes, but if anybody has any questions on any specific parts of this, do reach out. I'm happy to provide either notes I have or just walk through it in more detail. And yeah, maybe this is something we refer back to again in 5 years. 2030 edition, anyone? I will say that I'm sure my system will change a little bit before then too. It's just about having the right people in place who really kind of like encourage you to branch off from what you've played, and just seeing firsthand what outcome that can actually provide, I think, is what carries its weight. But it's been enjoyable experience doing this series again. I know, even though it doesn't necessarily get the best traffic on YouTube, I know there have been people who have benefited in the past and who were happy to see this come up again. So thank you guys for supporting. And yeah, let me know what else you'd like to see on this channel going forward. I'm going to try to start maintaining it a little more, perhaps. Okay, well, thank you guys for